Thank you. Good morning. I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to thank everyone for attending. Before we get into the three terrific presentations that we have for this session, I want to start with introducing the topic by getting on the same page about terminology and also a few comments about why we think this topic is important. So first, what does FDA mean by terms such as decentralized, point of care, and pragmatic in terms of clinical trials? Decentralized, as we heard earlier today, is when some or all of the trial activities occur at locations other than traditional trial sites. And these are typically away from investigators, for example, at participants' homes or local healthcare facilities. And we're going to hear a lot more about this in terms of GCP inspections from the presentations. Decentralized potentially may involve flexibility in terms of options for where trial activities may occur. For example, in the setting of contingency planning for disruptive emergencies, as we saw with the pandemic and also with war and natural disasters. The use of locations other than traditional trial sites isn't a new concept, but certainly we saw the implementation increase significantly over the last few years by necessity. So what about point of care and trials with pragmatic elements? So these terms refer to the integration of clinical investigations into routine healthcare. They typically involve the use of existing healthcare infrastructure, for example, the use of local healthcare providers to conduct trial assessments. They may use data that's collected during routine healthcare, also called real-world data. They may have simplified protocols with streamlined data collection and broad eligibility criteria, and thus could be more reflective of the population intended for the use of a drug. Point of care and pragmatic are also not new concepts, but they have been increasingly facilitated by technological advances, such as electronic medical records, digital health technologies, and the interoperability of these data systems. And this enables the integration of clinical studies into routine healthcare. So I just want to make two quick points about decentralized and point of care. The first is that we don't need to think of it as an all or nothing approach. Instead of thinking of them as distinct trial designs, it may be more helpful to think of them in terms of collective design elements or a set of tools that can be incorporated into trials as appropriate in order to make the trials more efficient and more inclusive. And the second point is that there is overlap between decentralized and point of care or pragmatic elements. And so, for example, the use of local healthcare providers to do study assessments would be considered decentralized because it's occurring away from the traditional trial site, and also point of care or pragmatic in that it involves the use of existing healthcare infrastructure. So lastly, why do we think that the incorporation of these innovative design elements can be important? The goal overall of modernization efforts in the clinical trial ecosystem is to accelerate the development of safe and effective new drugs so that they can be available for patients. And this involves the generation of reliable and generalizable study results in the most efficient fashion while ensuring participants' protections. The use of innovative design elements may increase efficiency in terms of trial costs and timeframes, may increase generalizability in terms of being able to enroll more diverse populations, and may increase resiliency in terms of the ability to continue trials during unexpected disruptions. And finally, incorporation of these elements may improve convenience and accessibility for participants which can improve both recruitment and retention, which of course is essential to the success of a trial. We've heard from patients and from patient groups that the flexibilities, particularly in terms of location, that were implemented during the pandemic were highly valued. And patients want this convenience and flexibility to continue in a post-pandemic world. So with that, let's shift our gears and focus on GCP compliance related to these innovative design elements. And let me briefly introduce the speakers. First, we'll hear from Dr. Leepai Sharf. She is a senior medical officer in the GCP assessment branch in the Office of Compliance in CDER. Next, we'll hear from Alicia Cassina. Alicia is a senior regulatory advisor for Health Canada, where she has served for nearly 30 years. And finally, we'll hear from Haley Dixie, a lead senior GCP inspector for MHRA. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And it's a pleasure to be here today to speak to you about clinical trials with decentralized elements and GCP inspections from the US FDA's perspective. Here is my disclaimer. Here is an overview of my presentation. I will give a brief overview of clinical trials with decentralized elements and review the US regulatory and GCP inspections on trials with decentralized elements. First, some considerations with the traditional or site-based clinical trials. In a traditional clinical trial, all study-related activities are centered at the clinical investigator site. Challenges associated with the site-based trials include that the locations of trial sites may be geographically limited and can require significant patient travel, which can restrict participation in the patients who live far away, or if they have mobility issues, for example. These challenges can impact on enrollment and may lead to a less diverse patient population. This new slide shows the data flow in traditional clinical trials. All the data is collected at the trial site and is transferred or transmitted to the sponsor or CRO, often through electronic data capture systems, where data is processed, stored, analyzed, and ultimately reported to FDA. So in a trial with decentralized elements, some trial-related activities may be conducted at sites away from the clinical trial site. Trial subjects may receive investigational product at home and may visit local healthcare providers for certain trial-related activities. Data may also be obtained from local laboratories and imaging sites or captured using devices like wearables or on a smartphone. Data flow may be different from a traditional clinical trial. Some data may be flowed through the clinical investigator to the sponsor and CRO, but other data may be captured directly by the sponsor and CRO through an EDC and would then flow back to the clinical investigator site. Trials with centralized elements may offer advantages that may help meet the public health need to accelerate medical product development. And as I mentioned before, these trials offer the participants convenience by bringing clinical trials closer to their home. DCTs may also help the industry by accelerating recruitment and increase diversity of the study population. Lastly, the increased use of computerized systems such as telehealth and digital health technologies offers the ability to capture data more frequently and efficiently. It is important to note that DCTs are not appropriate for every study, and determining if adding decentralized elements to a study is appropriate or not would depend on several factors, some of them listed here. I will give 3 examples from this list. The first example is the nature of the disease being studied. Trials involving patients with unstable medical conditions that need intensive care or other specialized trial-related procedures may need to be conducted in hospitals or established research centers. The second example is concerning trial design. Early phase trials, such as proof-of-concept trials that require frequent visits or studies that require intensive patient monitoring, are not appropriate for a decentralized approach. And the third example is concerning the type of investigational products being studied. Products in early stages of development with unknown safety profile or products with complex administration procedures may need in-person supervision by the investigator at the trial site and are also not suitable for a decentralized approach. So, let's see. There you go. Considerations for designing trials with decentralized elements. The sponsor should determine early on which activities must occur at the clinical site, which activities can occur at a local or mobile healthcare provider site, and which are amenable to remote technology solutions. And because of the complexity of the data flow, it is very important for the sponsor to implement additional trial safeguards, processes, training, and procedures to ensure participants' safety and adequate trial oversight. The sponsor should designate early where and how local source documents and electronic information will be stored. The ethic principles and the standards for the evaluation of clinical trials by IRBs and IECs for trials with standard design also applied to trials with decentralized elements. And particular attention should be given to privacy and confidentiality of the participants and security of data. The sponsor should also consider regional differences concerning remote technology availability, manage contractual relationship with non-trial personnel and facilities, and coordinate the timing of remote visits and procedures prior to the initiation of the study. And last, the sponsor should determine which trainings are needed for participants and study staff for telehealth visits and use of DHTs. So there are a lot of moving parts, but regardless of the clinical trial type, sponsors are encouraged to contact the FDA's review division early in the planning stages of the trial to discuss feasibility of the data to support a regulatory action. So what are the regulatory expectations for the conduct of a decentralized clinical trial? Trials with decentralized elements are subject to the same regulatory requirements as other FDA-regulated trials. FDA's GCP expectations are the same for trials with decentralized elements and traditional clinical trials. And regardless of the type of the clinical trials, the regulatory responsibilities of the clinical investigators, sponsors, and CROs do not change. That said, I do want to highlight some unique considerations for sponsors when conducting a trial with decentralized elements. My next comments are not in the slides, so please bear with me, and I will try to speak slowly. Clinical trial with decentralized elements has the potential to introduce variability into clinical trial data and may also increase risk to the quality and integrity of the data. Because of the data flow may be complicated and data may be received from a variety of sources, the sponsor needs to have a robust and well-defined data management plan, including a data flow diagram describing the data source and data flow to the sponsor for all data elements. This should include the methods being used for any remote data acquisition, as well as a list identifying all third-party vendors contracted for data collection, handling, and processing. DCTs would typically rely on a variety of computerized systems, and sponsors and CROs should ensure that DHTs are available and suitable for use by all relevant participant populations. The use of DHTs should comply with laws governing telehealth in different states and countries. Given the increased use of computerized systems and the increased complexity of the data flow, I repeat here that it's important that sponsors ensure adequate and close oversight of trials with decentralized elements. As with any trial, sponsors may use a variety of approaches to monitor trials with decentralized elements. And the monitoring plan should be based on the sponsor's risk assessment of the trial processes, procedures, and the data itself. FDA encourages the use of central monitoring to detect early signs of discrepancies, deviations, missing data, etc. A trial monitoring plan should describe how monitoring will be implemented to assess protocol compliance and data quality and integrity. The monitoring plan should specify the frequency with which each trial record and source documents will be achieved, and note any unique aspects related to the trials with decentralized elements procedures. So moving on to the clinical investigators' responsibilities. Investigators in clinical trials with decentralized elements have the same responsibilities as traditional trials. That is, to conduct and provide oversight, select qualified staff, follow informed consent procedures, obtain IRB approval, ensure IP accountability, adhere to study protocol and record keeping, communicate with monitors and sponsors, and report all adverse events. Clinical investigator oversight of trial personnel may be more complicated in DCT due to the increased use of remote trial personnel, as well as local healthcare providers to complete study-related risks. When permitted by sponsor, investigators may delegate others to conduct study-related procedures. These procedures may take place at participants' homes or at facilities authorized by the investigator. Investigators should ensure that the delegated staff are qualified by education, training, and experience, and that data obtained and completed, that procedures are conducted according to the protocol. Next, concerning FDA GCP inspections. For trials with decentralized elements, the sponsor should provide the location where the trials with decentralized elements related records and source documents are located. The sponsor should indicate where the investigator and other trial personnel can be interviewed for US FDA's inspection, and should ensure that all information required under applicable regulations are maintained for the trial audit and be accessible by FDA inspectors. Some more specifics to GCP inspections of trials with decentralized elements. The purpose and process for conducting inspections of DCTs is the same as for traditional trials. As with any marketing application submitted to FDA, we may inspect the sponsor, the CRO, and clinical investigator DCT sites as part of a marketing application review. Investigator inspections are conducted at the DCT site where trial records and source documents are located. So for inspectional purposes, the address of the DCT site should be the physical location where all DCT-related records and source documents are accessible, and the relevant responsible individuals, the investigator, and DCT study personnel should be available on site or by phone to answer any questions. When necessary, investigations may also take place at other facilities, such as local clinics and pharmacies, where trial-related activities occurred. So, in summary, regardless of the type of clinical trial, the regulatory responsibilities of investigators, sponsors, and CROs do not change. FDA's regulatory and GCP expectations remain the same. And the process for conducting inspections is the same for the trials with decentralized elements. I thank you for your attention. Our next two speakers are not here, and they will give their presentation via video conference. Thank you.
Hello everybody, and thanks for the introduction. It is my pleasure to talk today about Health Canada perspective on decentralized trials. I am going to talk briefly about cooperation with regulators, touch on the risk assessment and ICH guidelines in relation to decentralized trials, cover quickly impact of COVID on development of DCT elements, mention some regulatory challenges, and share a few thoughts on the future of DCTs. Let me start with the dialogue with regulators. For early planning and designing of the trial, the sponsor should discuss the approach to be used with the agencies. And we all have a system in place to discuss issues with stakeholders at this stage. MHRA has innovative licensing and access pathway, innovation scientific advice meetings, FDA pre-investigational new drug application meeting, and Health Canada pre-application meeting with the review directorates, and GCP requirements can be always discussed with the compliance and enforcement unit. Make sure to talk to the regulators and talk to them early. And this message is endorsed by all three regulators here today. In this next slide, I am going to briefly cover the risk assessment, as some elements were already mentioned by my colleagues. There is a lot to consider, starting with that investigator and sponsor responsibilities are the same as for any trial. The sponsor and the investigator are responsible for risks to the quality and the integrity of the study and the data being collected. The bottom line is that the risk assessment needs to be done and particular risks must be identified. And also, not every study is a good candidate for DCT. A trial may be intensive in terms of medical oversight or require more difficult treatments, or just the design doesn't work for DCT. The ability of trial participants, protocol-related risks including endpoints and equipment, investigational product, resources, digital data collection tools, it all needs to be taken into consideration, and these are just some example risk depends on. Currently, we don't have any specific ICH guidelines on the topic of decentralized trials. However, ICH E8R1 guideline promotes identification of critical to quality factors and concentrates on activities essential to the study. ICH E6R3 guideline encourages innovation and is intended to be flexible and modern. Development of some updates to this guideline was informed by lessons learned during the pandemic. I also would like to mention here the final concept paper, ICH E6R3 Guidance for Good Clinical Practice, Annex 2. Annex 2, additional considerations for interventional clinical trials, will include decentralized and innovative elements, so let's watch for development of this document. Moving promptly to the impact of the COVID pandemic for DCTs. The COVID pandemic really forced many elements onto more traditional trials simply so they could remain viable. As we all remember, the pandemic brought challenges that directly impacted clinical trials. Participants needed to avoid contracting the virus, healthcare resources were diverted to other priorities, and we all needed to follow public health recommendations. During this time, Health Canada issued notice to clinical trial sponsors titled Management of Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Pandemic. This notice addressed implementation of flexibilities such as remote visits or direct shipping that were really already available, but they were used much less commonly. Impacts were different in different countries, but most having consideration for what would be needed in the future. In general, the pandemic brought acceleration of acceptance of decentralized trials, and while some aspects still need to be explored, the pandemic offered opportunity for some new elements that would bring better recruitment and diversity. This slide shows you how vast our country is and how far potential clinical trial participants can be located from the main centers. Therefore, in Canada, we always had sort of a version of DCTs because of this large size of our country and its remoteness, with provision for some approaches like electronic informed consent or direct shipment to patients, but it was in our guidance without any explicit regulations. Modernization of Canadian regulations will bring clarity to this area, so stakeholders will have a good understanding of the regulatory requirement rather than case-by-case answers. And now why don't we talk about the commonly asked question, which is what is an investigator site and who is responsible for the medical oversight and other GCP investigator responsibilities. In Canada, the sponsor has responsibility for the overall conduct of the clinical trial, and the qualified investigator, QI, is responsible for the site and medical decisions. That being said, if a single QI is responsible for different locations, it is important to note that the logistics, for example, the investigator's time and ability to oversee the sites and geography, must support the arrangements. Current ICAG 6R2 definition states that the clinical trial site is the location where trial-related activities are actually conducted, and this definition is under the review. The proposed definition in ICAG 6R3 states that the investigator site is the location at or from where trial-related activities are conducted under the investigator/institution supervision. What constitutes a clinical trial site is not currently defined in Canadian regulations. Current regulations and provisions are included on this slide for your information, but moving into the future, under Clinical Trial Modernization Initiative, it was proposed to provide clarification on the definition on clinical trial site to accommodate DCT elements. By clarifying the definition of trial site, greater modernization could be achieved by promoting opportunities for clinical trials by using different approaches. For example, home visits, new technology, and this would foster greater agility in the regulatory framework. These different approaches, again, may encourage greater accessibility for Canadians to participate in clinical trials, participants who may not have otherwise considered a CT as a possibility, for example, due to a geographical barrier. Let's talk now about some future challenges in respect to DCTs. Challenges that would be requiring guidance to clarify, starting with activities to be considered safe for DCTs with examples of locations, for example, home care, and how they should be documented in the protocol and in all our Health Canada forms. The Research Ethics Board, REB, approval would need also to be clarified, as in Canada every site has to be approved by REB. So how is it going to be done for different locations for decentralized studies? The potential risks and resources to inspect DCTs and challenges for sponsors would also need to be clarified. As already mentioned, the sponsor in Canada is responsible for overall conduct of a trial, including oversight of all activities at the main site and off-site locations, records, data handling, training of all staff involved in the study. The investigator is responsible for the site, and the investigator needs to oversee all activities related to a study and also enrollment, consenting, and use of new technology. So all of this would require further clarification in a guidance. Speaking of remote informed consent, in addition to letter to stakeholders during COVID pandemic, Health Canada also issued clinical trials for medical devices and drugs relating to COVID-19 regulations, where the remote informed consent was covered in more details. As written consent is not always possible, a remote informed consent could be used as written or verbal remote informed consent. For electronic consent, the remote written informed consent documentation of process would be required, and when feasible, written confirmation of informed consent from participant is needed. For non-written informed consent, verbal, which would be obtained through readings of the content of the informed consent form to the participant, it would need to receive the individual informed consent before the witness, attestation by the witness, and documentation of the process would be required as well. And again, when feasible, written confirmation of informed consent from participant would be needed. Finally, a look at the future. Upcoming modernization of clinical trial regulations will bring clarity to this area, bringing a risk-based approach and more flexible framework. So the future of DCTs should be bright. The use of decentralized and hybrid trials has been accelerated by the pandemic and will remain an option going forward. Of course, some challenges remain. There are potential implications in a number of areas, including provincial, territorial jurisdictions. For example, qualified investigators, physicians, are licensed in Canada by provinces. Privacy of data could be a problem. Existing clinical trial processes, for example, notification or REB approval, we already talked about, roles and responsibilities of the sponsor and investigator, compliance and enforcement. So more guidance is needed from Health Canada, other regulatory agencies, and ICH. But for sure, updates of ICH G6R2 will provide additional flexibility, and as I said, the future of DCTs should be bright. And this would include my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, they may be answered by my Health Canada colleagues at the questions and answers session, or you may send questions to the email address included on this slide. So thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Hi everyone, I'm Hayley Dixie, a lead senior GCP inspector at the MHRA. I'm going to be carrying on the theme of talking about trials that have been involving decentralized and innovative features, and talking through some inspection case studies that we have had over the last couple of years. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to cover a brief recap following on from Lee and Alicia, and then I'm going to use the majority of my time to talk through what I know best, which is inspection. So we are going to look at some inspection case studies from the last couple of years, which have involved trials using decentralized and/or innovative features. We'll also take a look and consider what might be the common themes and issues emerging, and then summarise these learnings towards the end. So back at our last joint symposium in March 2022, which I hope many of you listened into, Dr. Kirsty Weidenbach, an expert medical assessor at the MHRA at the time, provided a comprehensive presentation on what a decentralised trial is. She covered key considerations on suitability for decentralisation through to example decentralised trials and their design. Lee and Alicia have just covered current guidance from the FDA in Health Canada on decentralised trials and the use of innovative features. So now I wanted to talk through what we have seen on MHRA inspections. With the first thing I guess I wanted to say is really that we haven't suddenly seen on inspection a sudden boom in fully decentralised trials, even with the pandemic. Decentralised features are obviously being seen more and more often, but fully decentralised and innovative ways of working have been seen so far and more commonly on inspection of non-commercial organisations in the UK. So just to recap, when I'm talking about decentralised trials and trials using innovative features, I'm talking about trials where some or all of the trial activities occur at locations other than a traditional clinical site. They may involve the use of digital health technology tools and other electronic systems such as ePros and IRTs to perform some or all study-related procedures at locations that are remote from the study site and remote, therefore, from the PI. There may also be use of innovative features, so clinical trials using existing systems that are in place for standard clinical care and integrating them in a more streamlined way for data collection for a trial, and therefore reducing the burden of the clinical trial on all parties involved. There are clear benefits of using decentralized trials and innovative features for clinical trials. However, there are some emerging common pitfalls, and these are what I'm going to talk through using some case examples. So the first case I would like to present involved a fully decentralized trial, and this was designed as such from the start to maximize recruitment and outreach. Consent was being performed remotely. It was being performed over the phone or on video calls between a central group or the local GP PI site and the volunteers. A database had been set up by the sponsor, and the consent was being documented in this clinical trial database only. So the consenter would provide the information over the phone, which may have been the GP site or a central hub, and then the volunteer would provide verbal consent, and this was then ticked and confirmed in the database by the consenter. So those that were taking the consent then confirmed that in the database. And this was based off of verbal consent from the participant. This process, so the process of documenting consent, was not fully detailed in the protocol. As part of some standard practice, as part of some standard practices at GP sites, calls may have been audio recorded. However, this wasn't a requirement of the clinical trial protocol itself. On inspection, which involved visiting a GP site, the site inspected did actually routinely record all of their calls and were actually able to provide some of these audio recordings during the inspection. It did take some digging around to locate these audio recordings for specific participants, but they were able to be located. These were then listened to as part of the inspection. And it was found that some of those listened to, that the volunteers had not always explicitly confirmed understanding and consent, leaving therefore a bit of a question mark as to whether the patient had in fact consented or not. So in this case, what was found was that there was no written consent obtained from the participants themselves, and neither was there a witness present, i.e. someone that could provide a second confirmation that verbal consent had actually been provided. It was also found that there was no robust process for ensuring that the participants had received a full copy of their signed informed consent form for their own reference. The database and other documentation did not record the version of the information sheet and the informed consent used at informed consent. Therefore, it was also not possible to verify which version of the informed consent the participant had completed themselves or had completed on their behalf, nor which version of the patient information sheet had been read by the participant. So the trial team responded to the inspection finding that they did have a way to link the version of the consent CRF to the PIS used, and that this was captured within the data and could be exported and extrapolated. Therefore, there was a way, albeit a complicated one, which potentially included some assumptions, but this wasn't all documented in the TMF or in the source documentation. And going forward, the trial team were able to add the informed consent form version and date to the PIS and the ICF documentation being used at the time of consent to create a much clearer audit trail. It was also found on this same inspection and with the same case that there was no ID check or process in place to authenticate participants. So how did the person taking consent, those that are on the phone taking the consent, know who they were talking to and that they were the same person that the IMP was shipped to and the same person that was present at subsequent visits? Essentially, do you even know you are talking to a real person? a participant, given the technology that's emerging, we would expect that ID check and process to authenticate participants was in place. There's also the need to consider, is the same person trying to enroll numerous times, particularly if the trial is trialing an IMP, which it might have potential resale value, for example, with COVID treatments at the time, and therefore there could be a significant risk for IMPs such as cannabinoids or psychedelics, etc., to be going out to non-trial participants if this process isn't robust. The trial team in this case were able to mandate NHS numbers and have in place cross-checks for duplicates as a response for this finding. Issues with the process for obtaining consent by a legal representative on behalf of a participant lacking capacity was also seen. So consent using remote methods for this decentralized trial were already complex and therefore at risk of compliance difficulties. Therefore, adding the extra complexity of situations where legal representatives are required for consent, then as you could expect, issues were found, such as missing details in the database and hand-typed consent documents with no further documentation to validate the completion had been done by the legal representative. So moving on to the second inspection case that I would like to present. So this trial involved innovative features. So, for example, they were using existing healthcare systems. In this particular case, they were using registry data for clinical outcomes, the clinical outcomes for primary and secondary endpoints, with clinical outcomes being death as one of those main ones. So this registry data was used alongside ECRF data. So it was captured from registry data as well as ECRF data, essentially having two data sets. The ECRF data was being compared with the registry data, and it was found that the analysis variables were created from either registry data or ECRF data. There was evidence that the data was being extracted from the ECRF, but was effectively being replaced by the linkage data algorithm as set out in an SOP. The ECRF reported data was therefore not always being used as the outcome data for analysis. So whilst the ECRF data remained the same, there was different data from another source being used potentially instead, i.e. from the registry data. We also found that there was no PI approval of any changes to the reported ECRF data being different in the analysis datasets as a result. So the trial team stated that the rules to change the data were all predetermined and blinded to treatment allocation, and the ECRF was not changed, therefore approval was not required from the investigator. So in this particular case, as I've just explained, so what we saw was that there was two sets of data sets being essentially put together and used for the analysis. What could have happened, and in theory the registry data could have been used as a way to centrally monitor data in the ECRF, and that would have been potentially a way to increase the accuracy of the ECRF without on-site or burdensome monitoring, having to go in and validate every source. And as on inspection, it was seen that the registry data was for what we actually saw in inspection was that the registry data was often more accurate than the primary endpoint data in the ECRF. But a central reconciliation could have been done and then queried back to the site as a way of monitoring that data and then ensuring final agreed data points were then used for the outcome analysis. Or potentially it could have all been declared in the protocol that data was being collected from registries and stating which data points and which registries were going to be used. And then you could have potentially not needed to collect all of that data and duplicate data in the ECRF, and as I say, to reduce that duplication. So we also found that there was no documented detailed assessment of the quality assurance of the registry data by the trial management team prior to the use of the data provided. It could not be confirmed whether the registry data in all cases would be reliable. Each registry is different, with the data being collected being subject to different quality assurance processes than others. Therefore, to determine the appropriateness of their use, these processes really need to be assessed, and this should all be documented within the TMF. So moving then to my final case, so case 3. So this trial involved decentralized elements such as central recruitment and screening, with blood pressure monitors being shipped directly to patients to be used at home. Data was then completed and submitted by patients using an application. And what we found in this particular case, which has become quite common, is that the trial risk assessment did not identify and therefore mitigate key areas of risk. For example, due to the nature of it having decentralized features, including shipment of IMP to patient homes, then there was a risk of capturing patient identifiable information and data in the sponsor database. And this was not captured in the trial risk assessment, and non-compliance was therefore further found in this area. So this is a common finding we have had recently, that the trial risk assessment was not updated throughout the trial in relation to substantial amendments and upon identifying significant issues and deviations, therefore missed opportunity to ensure equality by design and identifying the areas of potential compliance issues and mitigating them up front. And this really takes me into really the common themes of issues that we're seeing. So starting with from the sponsor perspective, we're seeing commonly that risk assessment and reassessment is often inadequate. So the new draft ICH DCP R3 principles propose evaluating risks to quality factors that could impact on patient safety, rights and well-being, and that the reliability of the trial results, and that sponsors should implement mitigation strategies to support the conduct of the trial efficiently, proportionately, and avoiding unnecessary complexities. We're also seeing commonly participant confidentiality breaches, with identifiable data being collected in sponsor systems. So as the sponsor are the ones in some of these cases providing the databases to be used to enable decentralized approaches to be taken, we're finding more commonly now that participant confidentiality breaches are happening. And we've also been seeing documentation and verification of activities becoming, again, more and more difficult. So you need to consider, how can you as auditors or us as inspectors see that oversight has been maintained and that processes were followed? But here, common again is the risk assessment process. And then common themes of issues that we're seeing at the site level is really in relation to staff delegation and responsibilities. This delegation in a decentralized trial design is arguably even more essential, as this should set out exactly who does what. There needs to be a clear and a strong process for how people are added to that delegation and authorized by the investigator. For example, if the trial is using home care nurses via a provider rather than existing staff that are already routinely working with the investigator, then the investigator really does need to ensure they have that oversight of those staff, how they're trained, and the qualifications being provided to the investigator to then enable that delegation of the task to them. And then the delegation log in itself, or the delegation documentation, should clearly support that process and demonstrate that that process has occurred. So to summarise, as Lee has already highlighted in her presentation, the fundamental rules of GCP can and do still apply, whatever the innovative design being used. So, for example, consent must be documented by the participant, although a proportionate approach can be taken. If innovative features are being used, an assessment for appropriateness and a compliance and risk should be completed and revisited throughout the trial. A risk assessment is really key. It's not a one-off for the trial. It is a living document that needs to be revisited. So to avoid issues, remember to apply a quality by design approach, identify your compliance risks and mitigate them wherever possible up front. If amendments and deviations do happen, then adapt to them and update your risk assessment. Thanks everyone, and that's the end of my presentation. Thanks all for listening.